Imagine you're living on the edge of civilization, your home just miles from untamed wilderness. And every night, you lie awake wondering if tomorrow you or your family will even survive. Sounds terrifying, right? Well, this was the reality for settlers and neighboring tribes in the Wild West. Life back then wasn't just hard. It was brutal, unpredictable, and often deadly. Among the fiercest of all were the Apache warriors, whose raids left towns in ruin, and women facing horrors that are almost impossible to imagine today. From being dragged miles from home, forced into marriages they never agreed to, scalped as warnings, whipped, burned, and mutilated, women endured unimaginable suffering. And make no mistake, every act of cruelty was calculated to strike fear, assert control, and send a clear message. Defy the Apache, and you paid the ultimate price. Stick around, because what you're about to hear will completely change the way you see life on the frontier.
So here's the deal. Picture living in a world where danger could strike at any second. Your home isn't just your safe space. It's a target. Your family, your livestock, even your very life could vanish in the blink of an eye. That's exactly what life was like for settlers and neighboring tribes during the Wild West, a place where survival wasn't guaranteed, and fear was basically a full-time companion. It wasn't just about the harsh land, scorching heat, or meager supplies. It was the people you had to watch out for. Among the most feared were the Apache tribes, legendary warriors who didn't just fight, they dominated, and women often bore the brunt of that brutal control. These weren't random attacks. Each raid was a calculated move, meant to intimidate, to send a warning, and to secure resources. And for the women who found themselves in the crossfire, life took a terrifying turn. Captured, stripped of choice, and forced into unimaginable roles, they became pawns in a deadly game of power and survival. Historical accounts describe women tied up, dragged for miles, left to face starvation, exhaustion, and trauma most of us couldn't even begin to imagine. One Spanish friar, Alonso de Benavides, wrote in the 1600s about the indescribable suffering of women captured by Apache warriors. A chilling reminder that fear was a weapon, wielded just as sharply as any arrow or blade. But here's where it gets wild. These raids weren't just about seizing supplies or territory. They were about controlling minds and crushing hope. And what happened next, once women were in the hands of their captors, was a level of cruelty that defined the harshest realities of the frontier.
All right, so picking up from the fear and uncertainty settlers and tribes lived with, let's talk about the raids themselves. The Apache weren't just fighters, they were survivalists, and their raids were as strategic as they were savage. Every strike had a purpose, gathering resources, asserting dominance, and keeping rivals and settlers on edge. It wasn't chaos for chaos's sake, it was calculated, cold, and terrifyingly effective. Women were especially vulnerable during these attacks. Once captured, their lives were basically taken over by someone else. They became commodities in a ruthless system of survival. Imagine being tied up, dragged for miles under a scorching sun, starving, dehydrated, and completely at the mercy of your captors. The psychological toll alone is hard to even fathom. Historian accounts like those of Alonso de Benavides describe the sheer horror and suffering endured by these women, emotional trauma that could last a lifetime. Captivity was only the beginning. Forced labor, servitude, and relentless punishment became daily life, and the raids weren't just about acquiring resources. They were designed to strike fear, making sure anyone who resisted would think twice. Settlers and rival tribes lived in constant terror because the Apache knew fear was one of the most powerful weapons you could wield. Generations grew up under its shadow, carrying scars both visible and invisible. And hold up, because what came next for these women would make the raids look almost merciful.
So here's where things take a darker turn. Captured women didn't just face raids and exhaustion. They were often forced into marriages they never wanted. For the Apache, marriage wasn't just about love or companionship. It was a strategic tool, a way to absorb captives into their society, erase their former identities, and secure alliances. These unions weren't consensual, they were a form of control, a way to dominate and reshape someone's life completely. Imagine being torn from your home, losing your family, your language, your culture, and suddenly being told, "This is your life now." Many women became property in the eyes of their captors, expected to serve, bear children, and pledge loyalty to people they didn't know. These forced marriages weren't personal, they were political. They strengthened the Apaches' hold on captured communities, ensuring that their influence extended far beyond the battlefield. The emotional and psychological toll was enormous. Lives were erased, autonomy stripped away, and freedom became an abstract memory. Women endured a life where every choice, every action was dictated by their new captors. Tacitus, the ancient historian, once said that the desire to dominate is part of human nature. And in the Apache context, this domination came through forced loyalty, subjugation, and marriages that left deep, lasting scars. But here's the thing that's even more chilling. Domination didn't stop with forced marriages. The Apache had other ways of sending a message, ways that made sure fear was etched into every mind they encountered.
All right, so after forced marriages, it only gets darker. Scalping. Yeah, the very thing you've heard about in Wild West stories wasn't just a gruesome act. For the Apache, it was a psychological weapon designed to terrorize enemies and anyone who might even think about challenging them. Scalps were more than trophies. They were statements, a visible reminder that defiance came at the steepest price imaginable. And it wasn't just men who were targeted. Women were scalped too, sending a brutal warning to settlers, rival tribes, and captives alike. Imagine seeing that, seeing a life cut short and used to strike fear into the hearts of everyone around. Anthropologists suggest that scalping had deep roots, borrowed from older tribal warfare practices or even influenced by European settlers' own methods. Herodotus, the Greek historian, described similar acts among the Scythians, noting they made cloaks from the scalps of their enemies. Different time, different place, but same raw, terrifying message. Conquer, dominate, survive. In the Wild West, scalping became more than an individual act of violence. It was strategic, a deterrent, a tool of territorial control. And while settlers and soldiers sometimes returned the violence in kind, the targeting of women added another layer of cruelty. These weren't just victims, they were symbols, reminders of vulnerability and the consequences of opposing Apache dominance. But it didn't stop there. The violence escalated and the methods of control became even more personal, brutal, and horrifying.
Picking up from scalping, the physical torment didn't end there. The Apache often used whipping and beating as a brutal way to enforce control over women in captivity. This wasn't just punishment, it was about breaking the spirit, asserting dominance, and making it painfully clear that resistance wasn't an option. Rawhide whips, heavy clubs, and relentless strikes became daily reminders that autonomy had been stripped away. The accounts of survivors are chilling. One of the most well-known is Olive Oatman, a young woman captured in 1851. She described brutal beatings inflicted to enforce obedience, a terrifying blend of fear and power. While some details of her story are debated by historians, her experiences reflect a wider reality. Captives endured repeated, cruel violence that left physical and psychological scars. For women on the frontier, life in Apache captivity wasn't just survival, it was endurance. Every strike, every punishment reinforced the reality that their lives were no longer their own. And it wasn't just about fear, it was about control. The Apache knew exactly how to manipulate terror, making every act of violence a tool to maintain power, ensuring compliance from anyone who might otherwise resist. But just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it did. There was a level of brutality that went far beyond beatings, one that was meant to terrify and send a message like nothing else could.
All right, now we're stepping into the absolute darkest part of this story. Beyond raids, forced marriages, scalping, and beatings,
The Apache sometimes resorted to burning and mutilation. These weren't random acts, they were deliberate, terrifying displays of power meant to crush hope and send a warning that rebellion or resistance came with unimaginable consequences. Women captured during raids could be forced to endure fire, sometimes from firebrands, sometimes from prolonged exposure to flames. This wasn't just cruel, it was psychological warfare. The goal was to reduce captives to symbols of suffering, making their pain a message to anyone who might consider opposing the Apache. And mutilation? Fingers severed, faces disfigured, bodies permanently marked. These acts weren't just about punishment, they were statements carved into flesh, stark reminders that defiance carried a permanent cost. Historical records from settlers and military accounts detail these horrors in grim, heartbreaking detail. And let's be clear, violence was reciprocal. Apache women were sometimes subjected to similar acts at the hands of settlers or rival tribes, fueling a cycle of revenge and bloodshed that seemed endless. For the women who survived, every scar, visible or hidden, served as a haunting reminder of a world where survival meant enduring the unimaginable, day in and day out. But as horrific as these acts were, they weren't just about pain. They were about dominance, control, and the unflinching reality of life on the frontier, a world where fear, brutality, and survival were inextricably intertwined.
So, looking back at all of this, the raids, the forced marriages, the scalping, beatings, and even burning and mutilation, it's hard not to feel the sheer weight of what women endured on the frontier. Life in the Wild West wasn't just tough, it was relentless, unforgiving, and often downright horrifying. Every act of cruelty tells us something about the extreme lengths people went to survive, to dominate, and to protect their communities. These stories aren't just history, they're lessons. They show us the human capacity for both fear and resilience, how power can be wielded in ways that break people down, and how survival sometimes demanded choices no one should ever have to make. For the women who lived through this, every scar, every memory was a testament to endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering. And here's the thing, thinking about this isn't just looking back, it's about understanding the roots of power, control, and humanity itself. What happened to these women shapes how we see history and reminds us that even in the harshest environments, courage and survival can leave a lasting mark. So take a moment, reflect, and think, if you were in their shoes, how would you endure? And don't forget, history only comes alive when we engage with it. Like, comment, and subscribe to uncover more stories that dig deep into the complexities of our past. Because your perspective matters, and every voice helps keep these lessons alive.